I'd like to introduce Professor Andrea Westlund, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her research focuses on personal autonomy, shared agency, and the ethics of friendship and love. She's currently working on a series of papers on the role of autobiographical narration in self-understanding, some of which we discussed in our seminar yesterday, autonomy and moral transformation. Her papers include selflessness and responsibility for self, is deference compatible with autonomy, deciding together, and anger, faith, and forgiveness. She's come from Milwaukee to ask you, who do we think we are?
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to both Yuval and Amy for organizing this conference and for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I hope I have this in more or less the right place. Everyone, I think, will have found a handout on your seat. There's nothing at all technical on the handout. It's really just a little bit of a map of the paper. Sometimes I find it helps to have something to look at and follow along. But with no further ado, I'll get started. It's become something of a commonplace in the literature on narrative agency to think of ourselves as narrators of our own lives, engaged in a kind of ongoing autobiographical self-interpretation. Although to some qualified extent I accept this idea, it's perhaps worth pausing to reflect on its peculiarity. Todd Chambers points out that neither autobiography nor biography are particularly natural or spontaneous forms of storytelling. Unlike anecdotes, jokes, reports, and other more commonly used forms, autobiographical narration requires an extended suspension of conversational turn-taking. And to quote Chambers, there are simply extraordinarily few social events in which one is asked to tell one's life story. Many of us do, for all that, manage to find occasions for self-narration. People sometimes tell their stories or fragments thereof to their children, grandchildren, or other loved ones. Not so long ago, it was relatively common to narrate one's life in installments to distant friends or relations through written correspondence, a practice which may have been partially replaced by the writing of personal blogs or by certain kinds of engagement with social media. It's not uncommon for people to engage in some type of private self-writing, keeping a journal or a diary, for example, which might be undertaken with the possibility of future readers in mind. In all of these cases, we interrupt the forward momentum of our lives to reflect back on and articulate where we've been and who we think we are. Why? It's of course unlikely that there's a single good answer to this question. My aim on this occasion is to begin to develop a connection between autobiographical narration and moral practices of answerability, blame, and forgiveness. There's some prima facie evidence in the history of autobiography as a genre that self-narration plays a role in these aspects of moral life. Many classical autobiographies have taken the form either of apology in the older sense of self-justification, or confession, which may mean either an acknowledgement of fault or weakness, or a declaration of belief, or both. Other genres of self-writing include the testimonial, in which the author bears witness, often to trauma, hardship, or injustice, and stories of redemption, in which the narrator assigns to hardship a redeeming value. These forms of self-narration play a recognizable role in our answerability practices, not only in formal self-writing, I would argue, but also in our informal, day-to-day moral dialogue, in which we challenge one another and attempt to answer for our choices and actions. Why, though, should self-narration figure so prominently in our answerability practices? The answers that make sense of our decisions and actions needn't always be narrative in form. So one task in this lecture will be to clarify the point or purpose of turning to self-narration in the first place. A second will be to illustrate its morally transformative potential. I'll argue in brief that self-narration is an apt response to questioning when the meaning of the choice or action under scrutiny depends on its place in a temporally extended, interpretation-sensitive sequence of events. And I'll say more about that later on. The self-narrator's response to questioning in such cases includes an attempt to fix the meaning of her choices and actions by putting them in a narrative context. The transformative potential of this exercise springs from the need to make sense to an audience, and sometimes from the further need to converge with that audience on a mutually acceptable narrative. As self-narrators, we present ourselves to an audience, whether real or implied, and at the same time project ourselves into the perspective of that audience. What we hear ourselves saying sometimes surprises us. After working through some preliminary points about answerability, I'll explore these ideas further through the discussion of several recent works of fiction, including, most centrally, Wally Lamb's novel, I Know This Much Is True, which some of you may have read. Apologies for the spoilers to those who haven't. I argue that autobiographical narration is valuable to us, at least in part because it compels us to view ourselves from the perspective of another, and this shift in perspective can, under the right conditions, force us to confront hard questions about ourselves. Finally, and more tentatively, I suggest that awareness of our limitations as self-narrators can yield a kind of ethical understanding that is connected to one form of forgiveness. So this brings us to the first section on the handout, answerability. So what does the activity of self-narration have to do with our answerability practices? I'll build an answer in two stages. In this section, I explain the practical role of self-interpretation in general in self-answerability. I then turn in the next section to self-narration in particular as a more specific form that self-interpretation may take. So let's begin by considering what happens when someone to whom I hold myself answerable calls into question my choices or actions. For the moment, let's not assume the question with which I'm faced concerns matters of moral rightness. It might rather concern matters of prudence, happiness, propriety, or something else. Perhaps my interlocutor is simply confused by my behavior and can't understand what I'm up to by any relevant norms. Answering for oneself requires explaining one's judgments and decisions in a way that will make sense of them to others. A sincere and well-formed answer will expose the meaning or intended meaning of the action, insofar as it reveals the reasons for which the agent acted. An answer that's not merely sincere and well-formed, but successful in its justificatory aims, will provide reasons that are good or good enough by relevant normative standards. A typical first step in the attempt to provide reasons for an action is to explain how the action is a means to some end that is seen as worthy of pursuit, or how it helps to realize such an end constitutively. A student might take a particular class, for example, both as a step toward completing a certain program of study and because in doing so her mind is engaged in a form of study that she values. In linking choices and actions to particular ends in one of these ways, we impart information about what we care about or what we see as important, and perhaps indirectly what we do not care about or see as important. One's answers thereby express some part of one's practical identity, understood as the constellation of concerns that structure one's practical or deliberative perspective. In so doing, one's answers provide an interpretive framework for understanding the behavior in question. Sometimes exposing the link between one's choices and actions and one's ends will be enough to settle the question at issue. Other times, further questions will be raised about the relationship between the choices and actions and the cited end. Still other times, the ends themselves will be at issue. That is, the concerns to which we initially appeal in giving our reasons for acting sometimes move to center stage, such that the interpretive framework we've provided itself becomes the focus of critical attention. What happens when it does? Our attempts to answer for our concerns, at least at first, often take the form of self-defense or self-advocacy. Again, apology in the older sense of self-justification. When faced with the challenge, we tend to want to communicate the value of what we take to be important and the appropriateness of giving it a place in our deliberative life, or giving it the place we do in our deliberative life. Though it is relatively easy to veer into excessive self-defensiveness, self-advocacy is a natural and, I think, unobjectionable stance as a default strategy. We cannot be willing to give up our cares at the drop of a hat, for this is incompatible with truly caring about the things we think we care about. This is an important kernel of truth in Harry Frankfurt's thesis that care is a commitment of the will. In its desiderative dimension, care requires more than simply having a desire, even a very strong one. and more also than wholeheartedly endorsing that desire. It also means wanting to continue to have the desire even when one decides it would be better, all things considered, not to act on it. The impulse to self-advocacy reflects this stabilizing dimension of care. At the same time, though, genuine answerability requires that the impulse to advocate for oneself and one's concerns be moderated by an appropriate attitude of humility. We must have the ability to recognize defects in the self-portraits we hold up for the scrutiny of others. Defects in self-understanding, we may not be who we think we are, and to put it bluntly, defects in ourselves. Sometimes we ought to be other than we are. Self-advocacy appropriately gives way to self-scrutiny when such gaps appear. So where does self-narration fit into all of this? And here we move to section 2 on the handout. We've gotten so far as to identify a role for the articulation of some self-interpretive framework or another in our everyday attempts to answer for ourselves. To answer for oneself is to give one's reasons for acting, and one's reasons flow, subjectively speaking, flow from what one cares about or perceives as important. In answering to others, we both advocate for our concerns and subject them to critical scrutiny where appropriate. So where exactly does narrative and self-narrative in particular fit into all of this? To begin with, it's worth noticing that advocacy on behalf of our concerns needn't always or even often take the form of explicit argumentation of the sort that philosophers engage in. In everyday life, we make use of a variety of different rhetorical techniques in explaining our judgments and actions to one another. And narrative figures rather prominently among those techniques. One might talk about the life of an admired other, or tell anecdotes, parables, or other stories that foreground a particular set of values or interests and maybe draw explicit or implicit parallels with one's own case. As I noted at the start, social occasions on which one tells one's own life story, at least in full, are rather rare. But in answering for oneself, one does sometimes tell a story about one's own life or some episode within one's life that manifests one's concerns and how one takes them to be expressed in one's actions over time. Indeed, sometimes it feels as though we need to tell our stories in order to make ourselves understood. Why might this be? It is, I think, because we use self-narration to resolve questions of meaning, when the meaning of our choices and actions is in question, and resolution depends, at least in part, upon the place of those choices and actions within a still unfolding sequence of events. Karen Jones provides a principled way of cashing out this idea, arguing that many properties of interest to us, including certain emotions and many of our self-ascribed attributes or characteristics, are trajectory dependent. Jones argues that being in love, for example, is trajectory dependent because descriptions of that property have temporally extended truth makers. Whether one counts as being in love at a particular time, given the set of physical, psychological, and motivational states one has at that time, depends in part, she argues, on what happens else when, or in other words, at another time. And in particular, on the eventual place of one's thoughts, feelings, and actions in a narratively structured whole. It's also interpretation sensitive on Jones's view because conceptualizing one's experience as being in love makes it more likely that the relevant truth-making trajectory will actually unfold by providing one with a set of culturally available scripts to follow. If trajectory-dependent and interpretation-dependent properties are plentiful enough in our lives, then this peculiar fact about meaning would help to explain why we often give narrative answers to questions about our decisions and actions. Sometimes saying what we are doing or what we have done would require us to project a trajectory in the context of which our choices would make one kind of sense or another. If Jones is right that the property of being in love, for example, is trajectory dependent, then there will be times at which the question of whether one has acted out of love cannot be given a determinate answer. Namely, times at which the relevant trajectory has not yet fully or fully enough unfolded. In such cases, a characterization of one's reasons given at a particular time offers an interpretation of a set of psychological states and dispositions, which itself may have an effect, though not necessarily a decisive one, on an unfolding trajectory. insofar as it gives the agent one of those culturally familiar scripts to follow in her subsequent choices and actions. So one role that narrative self-interpretation plays in answering for ourselves is plausibly a prospective one. While Jones focuses primarily on emotions and on love in particular, she also makes the intriguing remark that identities, such as being a political activist, being queer, and perhaps even all practical identities, may also be trajectory dependent. Jones does not say exactly what she means by a practical identity, but the phrase is, of course, closely associated with Christine Korsgaard. Korsgaard characterizes a practical identity as, quote, a description under which you value yourself, a description under which you find your life to be worth living and your actions to be worth undertaking, end quote. In this paper, I make use of a rather more generic notion of practical identity, which I glossed earlier on as the constellation of cares and concerns that structure one's practical or deliberative perspective. One's status as caring about something or having a particular concern is, I think, a very plausible candidate for trajectory dependence, and one that has special importance for our answerability practices. To care about something is to perceive it as important, and to be subject to a set of desires and dispositions, both cognitive and emotional, with respect to how it fares. When one perceives something as important, one sees and treats it as a source of practical reasons, reasons to feel and act in certain ways. It provides constraints on one's will and structure to one's deliberations. Can we determine from a time slice of the agent's psychological profile what an agent cares about? Does the claim that one cares about something have truth makers that can be entirely present at a time, rather than truth makers that are extended across time? We might come to doubt that it can have truth makers that are entirely present at a time for the same reasons that Jones comes to doubt that being in love has truth makers that may be present all at one time. The strongest rival to the narrative conception of love, Jones notes, is a dispositionalist view. The view that love is a suite of dispositions that either are or are not in place, allowing that there may be some fuzziness around the onset of love, where they might be mostly but not fully in place, for example. Jones raises a couple of worries about this approach. I'll skip the first, but the key point, she arrives at the key point by considering how we would respond to time slice identical twins who have exactly the same set of dispositions at time t, but who go on to follow different trajectories. Suppose neither of the twins yet has the full set of dispositions we associate with being in love, but one goes on to develop them while the other does not. Our practices of individuating love relationships, Jones argues, allow us to include in the episode of twin A's love the time slice t, even though we do not conclude that twin B, too, must have been in love at that time. Identity of dispositions does not determine identity of emotion. Narrative structure matters. Now, my aim here is not to offer a defense of Jones' position on love. I will leave that to her. But a parallel move, I think, can be made with respect to practical identity and the concerns that compose it, and might even be more intuitively compelling. Suppose twins A and B share, at time t, an identical partial set of the emotions, desires, and dispositions that go into caring about, say, environmental conservation. Twin A goes on to follow a trajectory that leads her to developing the full suite of dispositions, building a life around conservation and identifying herself as an environmental activist. Whereas for twin B, the partial set dwindles and withers away, being replaced ultimately by other emotions, desires, and dispositions, other concerns. It seems to me that the author of twin A's biography might rightly say that the young twin A already cared about environmental conservation and date her history as an activist in such a way as to include that time. Twin B's biographer, on the other hand, would speak very misleadingly if he were to retrospectively describe the young twin B as a budding environmentalist. The claim that all practical identities are trajectory dependent may turn out to be too bold. Some practical identities seem less voluntary and more fixed than others, but as long as some properties that might enter into an account of what we do are trajectory dependent, the answers that we give to what and why questions posed to us by others will sometimes implicitly place us within the sense-making context of a projected narrative. In answering for themselves, young twins A and B would have to account for themselves and their choices against a backdrop of indeterminacy about their identity constituting concerns. They don't yet know how their stories will turn out. The interpretive commitments they make early on may influence the course they follow, but cannot determine it entirely. The answers they give to others are in part aspirational. Notice that the perspective role played by self-narration on this account has a social dimension. When we answer for ourselves to others by offering these interpretations, we sometimes find that others will provide us with competing interpretations. Counter stories, which if adopted may counteract the trajectory shaping effects of the original narrative. In this way, we negotiate our interpretations of indeterminate psychological states in dialogue with others, jointly shaping the way in which meaning-determining trajectories actually unfold. This is what happens, for example, in A Brief Exchange Between a Young Woman and Her Doctor that Jones draws on from Jeanette Winterson's novel Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. The young woman describes a fizzing in her stomach and shyly confesses that she is in love. "You might be in love," the young woman's doctor says, "but you also have an ulcer." A second answerability-related role for autobiographical narration is retrospective in its orientation. It is clear, indeed it is a truth that lies at the heart of much autobiographical writing, that we do not always know what kind of trajectory we're on until we're able to look back on it from a later time, at which point it has more fully run its course, and the meaning of earlier choices and actions begin to fall into place. The need to answer for ourselves sometimes compels us to attempt for the first time to get a trajectory into view all at once, so as to be able to place certain contested episodes into its sense-making context. Like prospective narrative interpretations, retrospective self-narratives may also run up against counter-interpretations offered by others, or even against counter-interpretations that suggest themselves to the narrator herself as she attempts to formulate the story in a particular way for the benefit of an audience. In the retrospective case, it is sometimes too late for a counter-interpretation to reshape the trajectory followed by the narrator, but a counter-interpretation might certainly reshape the narrator's emotions, attitudes, and reactions in light of her story's newly perceived meaning. It's time, I think, to consider a robust example. Autobiography plays a central role in Wally Lamb's novel, I Know This Much Is True. The novel's primary narrator, Dominic Birdsey, reflects on his own past as he attempts to come to terms with his twin brother Thomas's schizophrenia and with his own somewhat inchoate sense of guilt about his brother's plight. Over the same period of time, he begins to read his grandfather's quote-unquote inspirational autobiography, which he has had translated from Italian as a gift for his terminally ill mother, Concertina. Concertina never actually gets to read her beloved Papa's story before her death, which, as it turns out, is probably for the best. The autobiography is rather grandiosely entitled The History of Domenico Onofrio Tempesta, a great man from humble beginnings. As Dominic notes wryly, he had a pretty good idea of himself, didn't he? Domenico did, as it turns out, have a pretty good idea of himself, only that idea could not withstand the process of writing his own story. His daughter Concertina puzzles aloud to Dominic about the difficulties she remembers her papa having during his summer of writing. He fired and rehired his stenographer repeatedly, feeling uncomfortable in the presence of an audience and accusing him of modifying his dictation to make him look bad. He could hardly bear to hear the sound of the stenographer's typing. All that remembering made him cranky, Concertina says. When the stenographer finally refuses ever to come back, Domenico retreats to the backyard, his little piece of Sicily, to finish the story himself, longhand. Over the course of the summer, he sobs and wails over the pages as he sits in that yard. At one point, he tells Concertina he will throw the whole thing in the ash barrel when it's finished and set a match to it. As far as Concertina ever knew, Domenico wanted to write his story for the benefit of young men back in the old country who would, quote, want to read about how one of their own had come to America and made good, end quote, and might be inspired to do likewise. It's only in the pages of the autobiography itself, which we eventually read along with Dominic, that we learn that Domenico was assigned the task of writing his life story by his priest as a form of penance. Domenico protests but agrees to do it, and then procrastinates for years over the writing itself. The story he finally pens is full of pride and self-justification, and of wild accusations against those who have wronged him. But his private anguish speaks volumes. He is not who he thought he was, and it is his own story that tells him so. The story of Domenico's unraveling reveals the trajectory dependence of his identity as a role model to other young Sicilian men. His concern with his role as an inspirational figure appears to form a core part of his practical identity. It's deeply important to him to set an example by making good as an immigrant in a new world, which, as he understands it, requires working one's way up through hard work and selfless dedication, providing for one's family, and building a solid foundation for one's descendants' future well-being. The story he tries to tell about himself is framed as a success story with an upward trajectory, marked by perseverance through hard times. But as he puts his choices and actions in writing, he begins to see a different story unfolding itself before his eyes. The story of a man who gets ahead through the ruthless pursuit of his own self-interest, who terrorizes and controls those closest to him with physical and psychological violence, and who will hand down to his descendants little more than a history of trauma and abuse. Early acts that may have seemed to exhibit only resolute determination or tough love take their place in a story that's marked by a pattern of cruelty and hard-heartedness. Now, Domenico's self-writing does not culminate in any sort of mea culpa, and Dominic concludes that his grandfather never really got the hang of penance. But there appears nonetheless to have been some inner change, and that change appears to be non-accidentally related to the process of self-narration. The act of systematically telling his story requires Domenico to put into coherent order a series of events and revelations that came out as a jumble in his earlier conversation with his priest. It seems he's never before tried to do this, to hold it all in view at once, to take it in at one sweep. His autobiography strains to be teleological in form. He attempts to figure early events as justified in light of his distinctive calling in life. But there's something simply incredible about his story. The telos, he asserts, cracks under pressure. He's not an exemplar. His self-conception, absolutely unshakable when viewed synchronically, begins to crumble under the pressure of diachronic articulation. So we've arrived at the main point that I'd like to draw from this extended example, where key aspects of one's practical identity are trajectory dependent. Recognizing that one's identity is other than one thought depends on one's ability to get the relevant trajectory in view alongside one's synchronic self-understanding, which might, as it were, be frozen in time, and to recognize where the two have come apart. This is a complex ability, and there's no guarantee that a mere knack for storytelling will suffice. Left unconstrained, the stories we tell are every bit as likely to conceal as they are to reveal our self-misconceptions. A slightly more shameless, self-confident grandfather might have been able to pull off his self-aggrandizement and remain a hero in his own eyes. But Domenico, in Lamb's novel, cared enough about the perspective of his intended audience that he could not keep his distorted self-image intact. Even the accidental audience provided by his stenographer proved to be too much for him to bear. When we take on the autobiographical perspective as a way of answering for ourselves to an audience to whom we hold ourselves accountable, there is normative pressure on us to tell a story that can stand up to critical scrutiny. And this pressure can compel us to give up some of our most cherished misconceptions. It's to this idea that I turn my attention in the next section of the paper, which is section 3 on the back of the handout. In telling our stories to one another, we aim to be understood and are thus constrained by norms of intelligibility. At a minimum, we need to make sense to our audience. Is narrative intelligibility fundamentally different from other forms of sense-making? David Velleman argues that it is. Instead of ordinary causal psychological understanding, which is achieved by explaining actions in terms of motives, concerns, character traits, and other psychological features of the agents who perform them, Velleman argues that narrative explanation generates emotional understanding. When presented with a narrative explanation, that is, we know not only what has happened and how, but also how to feel about it. Velleman argues that the nature of narrative understanding is linked to the nature of narrative itself. On his view, a particular recounting of events counts as a narrative rather than a mere annal or chronology in virtue of, quote, its power to initiate and resolve an emotional sequence in its audience, end quote. Unstable emotions, like fear and hope, tend to motivate behavior that in turn spurs further emotional development, ultimately yielding more stable emotions that resolve the earlier unstable ones. Grief, pity, gratitude, relief, disappointment, and so on are characteristically stable emotions that complete or resolve an emotional cadence. Velleman emphasizes that the closing emotions replace and subsume earlier emotions, such that the emotional meaning of earlier events, that is, how we feel about them overall, depends on how the story ends. What role might norms of emotional intelligibility play in our endeavor to answer for ourselves? When we tell our stories, it's plausible that at least part of what we are doing is attempting to communicate the emotional meaning of a sequence that a sequence of events has had for us, and to elicit corresponding emotional responses in others, including responses involving moral emotions, I think. I say corresponding responses rather than the same responses because an identically matching response would not always be apt. A grieving self-narrator, for example, does not necessarily intend for her audience to feel grief along with her, but to experience some kind of appropriate response to grief, perhaps sympathy, or wonder at life's fragility, or a sense of shared vulnerability, or appreciation of the profound value of what's been lost. A parallel point could be made with respect to a range of other reactions. Sometimes we seek emotional support, sympathy, or solidarity, sometimes confirmation, reassurance, or forgiveness. Sometimes perhaps all we want is understanding or acknowledgement. But in general, what we seek is a mesh or harmony between our own emotional understanding of the sequence in question and others' understanding thereof. But notice that when we tell our stories specifically in the context of answering for ourselves, answering for our choices and actions, as opposed, say, to bearing witness or testifying in ways that call others to account, the reactions we elicit in others are not just reactions toward us as the subject of a sequence of events, but toward us as agents. Such reactions contain an evaluative dimension concerning the question of whether we have acted well or badly, excusably or inexcusably, coherently or incoherently, and so on. Such reactions have a practical impact insofar as they partly shape the terms of any further interaction between us. Here, too, we seek a harmony of attitudes. We care sometimes desperately that others see us as we see ourselves and feel about us in ways that mesh with how we feel about ourselves. Divergent interpretations may strike us as harsh or unfair, even vaguely threatening. Telling our stories can be a way of attempting to disrupt uncharitable narratives projected onto us by others, and of trying to show our emotions and choices in what we think of as their true light. Of course, the motives that we have to shape others' emotional reactions to us include some less admirable ones as well, for others' interpretations, even when critical, are not always uncharitable. In one's own case, if anywhere, one has a motive to present one's story in the most flattering of possible lights, so as to elicit the most salutary of possible reactions. Think again of Domenico Tempesta's strong desire to present himself as an exemplar in his own story. Clearly, we may use narrative to manipulate or deceive both others and ourselves, but we can learn quite a bit from the way in which such manipulation and deception is received when detected. From the point of view of the audience, manipulation and deception in autobiographical narration present a moral problem. We might expect and accept that there is a constructive or creative element to autobiographical storytelling, but we nonetheless observe a distinction between autobiography and fiction. Though the dividing line can be tricky to nail down with precision, we subject self-narratives to norms of truth as well as norms of intelligibility. We do so, it seems, even when the narrator isn't someone we know personally. You might recall, for example, the backlash that arose against James Fry, I'm not sure, author of the purported memoir A Million Little Pieces, in the wake of the revelation that key parts of his account of his experience with addiction and rehabilitation were fabricated. After initially standing by the book as being the essential truth of his life, he eventually took a repentant stance, stating that the same demons that had embroiled him in his addictions had led him to publish the book as nonfiction after it had been rejected by several publishers as a novel. While he and his lawyer contended that the inaccuracies did not fundamentally alter the meaning of the story he told, what seems to have bothered his readers is that the story, whatever exactly it meant, was not his. So when it comes to autobiography, being a good story is not enough. Our responses to self-narrative are guided by norms of credibility as well as norms of narrative intelligibility. A memoir, autobiography, or other self-narrative shapes its audience's emotional reactions, not just to a fictional character, but to the narrator, him or herself. If we come to admire or sympathize with the narrator on false pretenses, we feel betrayed and manipulated. Being misled by the author of a popular memoir may never have much in the way of a practical effect on one's own life, but our reactions in such cases mirror those that we would quite properly have to manipulative self-narrators with whom we do have a personal relationship. In personal relationships, the stories we tell one another about ourselves directly shape, or at least have the potential to directly shape, our reactions to and interactions with one another. This potential is not merely incidental, but part of the point of such narration. Thus, it is entirely reasonable that audiences tend to hold self-narrators answerable for their narrative self-presentation. Ideally, self-narrators hold themselves answerable to their audience in return. We certainly seem to expect them to. And so, at some level, we monitor self-narratives for credibility, even as we attempt to absorb the emotional understanding they aim to impart. We are aware that as we come to feel a certain way about a narrated sequence of events, we're also settling on an emotional response to the narrator's role in those events, and indeed toward the narrator himself. The narrator, as I've suggested, invites us to have a particular kind of response to him. To induce us to have the desired response, the story must be good, not only in the sense that it takes us through a familiar emotional cadence. It must also give a jointly acceptable interpretation of the events in question, which are not, after all, fictitious, but exist in the public domain. Only a credible story will support the set of concerns claimed by its teller, along with the reactive attitudes that would be appropriate to someone who has acted from those concerns. In making one's story public, even in a limited personal way, one exposes it to comparison with other independent sources of evidence, including the recollections and documentation of others. This exposure is perhaps the most obvious sort of check on the fancy of a storyteller. Again, I'll turn to a literary example. The self-narrating protagonist of Julian Barnes' novel, The Sense of an Ending, makes the role of witnesses a central theme in his reflections on his own historically articulated self-understanding. What he thinks he wants is corroboration of his own understanding of a particular episode in his past. And he laments that as time goes on, there are fewer and fewer that can provide it. But then as his own story begins to come under pressure, he actively avoids seeking out those few witnesses who remain. What if their corroboration proved the opposite of helpful, he asks. When he ultimately does get corroboration, it is indeed of the unhelpful sort. Unhelpful in one sense, that is, but very helpful in another. As he begins to expose his memories to an audience that can answer back, he begins to see how selective and self-serving his self-interpretations have been, and to realize that his reluctance to put his story to the test was tied to his reluctance to own up to a less flattering portrait of himself. The role of others is no longer to corroborate his story, but to challenge it. How often do we tell our own life story, he asks? How often do we adjust, embellish, make sly cuts? And the longer life goes on, the fewer are those around to challenge our account, to remind us that our life is not our life, merely the story we've told about our life. Told to others, but mainly to ourselves. That's the end of the quote. Domenico Tempesta, on the other hand, was apparently able to recognize his own sly cuts, or at least to begin to, without actually presenting his story to its intended audience, just formulating his autobiography for the benefit of an imagined audience seems to give him a vantage point from which to detect the mismatch between the story he wants to tell and the raw material with which he has to work. Domenico, as self-narrator, puts himself in a position to recognize such a mismatch by projecting himself into the perspective of the audience to whom he addresses himself. In asking, how will it look to them, the narrator is prompted to abstract from what he thinks he knows about himself and consider how it looks from another point of view. The idea that projecting oneself into another's point of view may allow one to get some critical distance on oneself is not original, nor is the idea that narratives can help us to do this. But the idea does bring into focus the point that I want to make about the connection between self-narration, practical identity, and trajectory dependence. Unlike the agent, who focuses myopically on the concerns by which she takes herself to be motivated at a particular time, the self-narrating agent directly confronts the trajectory dependence of certain aspects of her identity. Of course, the myopic agent and the self-narrating agent may be one and the same agents at different times. So long as he's sufficiently responsive to counter-interpretations, an agent's attempt to self-narrate will put him in a position to notice a mismatch between the story that would be needed to support his synchronically articulated self-concept and a story that actually makes better sense of his involvement in a series of events. What is it for a story to make better sense, though? Drawing again on Velleman's account of emotional understanding, one possibility is that a story makes better sense when it evokes a more fitting emotional cadence in light of interpersonal corroboration of the events it represents. A credible story has the effect of fixing the meaning of certain actions and choices between the narrator and the audience, thereby bringing their emotional responses into alignment with one another. Hearing an incredible story is a bit like hearing an unfunny joke. We know the joke's teller means for us to find it funny. He invites our amused laughter, and indeed finds it funny himself, at least until he's met with stony silence or awkward chuckles from his audience. But we cannot quite appreciate it as funny, given what he's actually said. So too with Domenico's story. One cannot embrace the emotional cadence he intends to lead us through, a cadence that would conclude in admiration of a life well lived, tempered with regret that it had been marred by the meddling of less admirable others. Instead, that cadence rings false. We find ourselves feeling disadmiration and disapprobation towards Domenico and sympathy for those he rails against. Something jarring happens when a self-narrator recognizes, either in fact or proleptically, that his audience cannot share the understanding he intends to impart of himself. As in the case of the unfunny joke, the audience's inability to complete the intended cadence will resonate with the narrator, such that the narrator likewise will become unable fully to embrace it, at least without further reflection. Thus, we limit our own ability to embrace incredible stories about ourselves by narrating our lives, or some fragment thereof, to an audience to whom we hold ourselves accountable and attending to their reactions. So this brings us to section 4, and hopefully the remainder of this won't take too long. Are we doing all right for time? Okay, good. I'll conclude with some rather brief and speculative comments about the effect that self-narration might have on our moral emotions, and in particular on blame and forgiveness. Forgiveness, both of oneself and of others, emerges as a central theme in the Lamb novel, from which I draw my central example. In asking Domenico to write his story as a form of penance, Domenico's priest's idea seems to have been not just that Domenico himself was in need of forgiveness, but that if Domenico could recognize how short he had fallen of his own ideals, he might become able to forgive others, including his wife and daughter, for not being exactly what they seemed either. Domenico, as we've seen, never quite got there. But things are different for his grandson, Dominic, who reads his grandfather's story in the course of revisiting the history of his own relationship with his brother and his domineering stepfather, Ray. Dominic blames Ray for Thomas's suffering. Thomas is his brother, but also feels complicit in it. As he comes to terms with his grandfather's confession, though, he seems able to achieve a level of acceptance, first of Ray and eventually of himself, that one might regard as a form of forgiveness. What's going on here? It's not as though Domenico's confession provides any new insight into Ray's motives or Dominic's own, or in any way sheds light on the cause of Thomas's mental illness or suffering. The story seems to deal in lessons at a different level of abstraction, concerning, for example, different ways of responding to moral imperfection. The message that Dominic most clearly carries away from the autobiography is that he, like his grandfather, would do better not to feel, quote unquote, so sinned against, as he puts it to his therapist. What leads to this insight is nothing other than his recognition of how tenuous his grandfather's self-understanding and how toxic his blaming attitudes turned out to be, along with a pang of self-recognition, a sense that he himself carries some of his grandfather's confrontational attitude toward the world. In a confrontational mode, we focus on the gap between what others do and the normative standards we take to apply. We take their actions to express a skewed sense of importance, often of their own importance relative to ours. In this sense, our blame is a reaction to what we take to be their culpably flawed self-understanding. It is, in a way, a criticism of their practical identity. Consider that when you think a person's reasons for acting fall culpably short, you might challenge her precisely by asking, in a confrontational tone, "Who do you think you are?" When caught up in these tense confrontations, we typically are not really inviting an answer to that question. We do not seek augmented understanding of the other. Instead, we use the question to declare that we see something about the other to which she is oblivious, and to insist upon bringing her shortcomings to her attention too. We imply that she is other than she thinks she is, and we seem to presuppose that we can get her to see herself from a new angle by asking her who she thinks she is. This demanding attitude has its moral place, I suppose, but wrongdoers aren't often just exactly who we think they are either. And it is morally important to attend to the answers that they might actually give to the question, "Who do you think you are?" We might find, by attending to the reasons they cite, that it is we who misunderstand what they are up to. In a slightly more complex case, we might find that their reasons for acting as they do depend on a narrative understanding of what they're up to that diverges from our own. When this is the case, questions of credibility, of which is the better narrative, become central to the question of how to react. When the future of a relationship hangs in the balance, the question may be whether we can converge on a shared narrative about what's transpired and how to feel about it. But there is, finally, another way to react to the divergence between who others think they are and what they think they are doing, and who they seem to us to be. For we are all vulnerable to the failures of narrative self-understanding that give rise to such divergences. The idea that we may not be who we think we are either is sometimes what pulls us back from our blaming responses and softens our reactions to others' imperfections. I do not think this is always a moral mistake. Philosophers working on forgiveness sometimes puzzle over the proverb, "To understand all is to forgive all." Some think the proverb can't possibly state a truth. If increased understanding of a situation is what leads one to give up one's blame or anger, the argument goes, then forgiveness isn't really called for in the first place. For if the new understanding leads us to see the so-called offender's act as excused by extenuating circumstances, or if it leads us to see the act as justified by factors we had not previously been aware of, then the act is simply excused or justified, and there's nothing left to forgive. This has always struck me as an unsatisfactory dismissal of the thought expressed, albeit imperfectly, in the proverb. It's not clear that we have one unified concept of forgiveness. We use the term in various different ways. And one usage marks a kind of forbearance or non-judgmentalism toward others that's rooted in a sense of the fragility of our grasp on the full moral import of anyone's actions, including one's own. I prefer Simone Weil's version of this idea to that expressed in the more commonly cited proverb, which I have at the top of the handout. She writes, "I also am other than what I imagine myself to be. To know this is forgiveness." Rarely can it be said that we actually come to understand all. But if what we come to understand is the relative poverty of our own self-understanding, we might be led to a less harsh reaction to the perceived shortcomings of others. Is this softening forgiveness proper? Given that I suspect forgiveness is a plural concept, I would say at most that it's a proper form of forgiveness. Even if it is not the same phenomenon that most moral philosophers have in mind, it's a morally significant kind of understanding that seems to be achieved by understanding first how others understand themselves, who they think they are, and second, by coming to realize how far off the rails our own self-understanding might go. This kind of understanding resembles but is not identical to what Cheshire Calhoun describes as aspirational forgiveness. Calhoun aptly points out that moral assessments of persons typically are made by slicing their actions and character traits out of biographical context, and argues that putting actions and character back into biographical context can help us to make sense, though not necessarily moral sense, of their choices. In particular, doing so can make biographical sense of them. Aspirational forgiveness for Calhoun means that one stops demanding that a person be different from what she is. It is the choice not to demand that the wrongdoer improve, based, as Calhoun would have it, on the realization that it would be cruel and disrespectful of the sense-making choices that allow the wrongdoer to, quote, sustain an integrated rather than a fragmented biography, end quote. I'm not myself convinced that biographical understanding is best thought of as leading to or calling forth moral disengagement. While there may well be situations in which it would be inhumane to demand of someone that they be different, we often manifest not only our respect for, but acceptance of others through continued moral engagement. Moreover, we appropriately expect our interlocutors to tolerate some disintegration of personal biography in the interest of increased self-understanding and moral insight. I do, however, think that biographical understanding has the potential to restructure moral engagement, shifting us away from an adversarial model and tempering moral anger with a form of compassion and indeed humility about the limits of our own self-understanding. The Tale of Two Dominics points to something like this moral. The novel draws a contrast between time slices and narrative wholes to suggest that sometimes others are quite other than they think they are, that they think biographical and moral sense come together, not because they're moral monsters, but because their biographical self-understanding is flawed. It is all too easy to recognize that the same may be true of us. If we were to tell our own stories, what would we learn about ourselves? We might come to hope for the degree of acceptance or forgiveness that Dominic is in the end able to show his stepfather. So, just a couple of last words. It is striking that so much autobiography has taken the form of confession. As noted at the outset, confession has a double meaning. It can mean to attest to or declare one's commitments, or to own up to a wrongdoing or mistake. The double meaning is apt in the case of autobiography, and of self-narration more generally, particularly in its role in self-answerability. In answering for ourselves, we both attest to our guiding concerns and subject them to scrutiny as needed. Our self-narrations enter at several different points in this process and fulfill different functions. We self-narrate prospectively, interpreting properties of ourselves and our choices that are trajectory dependent. We self-narrate retrospectively in attesting to the meaning of choices and actions that we take already to be narratively fixed. And we sometimes self-narrate further in response to the realization that we've managed somewhere to get things wrong. After all, we usually want in some way to redeem our mistakes, and one way to do so is to put them in the context of a story of positive transformation. The process of self-narration, then, is valuable in part precisely because it can be destabilizing. We learn from it because we don't just make ourselves up. We are humbled and sometimes transformed by the very process of trying to make narrative sense of ourselves. We learn that we are other than we imagine ourselves to be. And that's